Between 1853 and 1857, a Catholic priest named Father Ambrose Croke recorded 9 family exhumations in Caledonia County, Vermont, called in by Irish immigrant farming families, convinced that their dead were rising to consume the living. The only explanation these communities could produce for the tuberculosis epidemic, destroying them one household at a time. What Croke noticed at every graveside and carefully documented in a leather-bound journal he carried beneath his cassock was not evidence of the supernatural, but something far more precise. Every one of the 9 deceased had drawn their drinking water from the same half-mile stretch of Keene Brook, which ran downstream from a dairy operation owned by a landowner named Silas Harwick. Croke spent 4 years cross-referencing deaths, water sources, and soil drainage patterns, pressing watercress samples from the contaminated stream between the journal's pages as physical evidence, concluding 30 years before Robert Koch identified the tuberculosis bacillus, that the illness moved through a shared environmental source and not through the spiritual contagion his communities feared. Vermont's State Health Board, reviewing Croke's findings in 1858, dismissed the journal as the superstitious record of a Catholic priest conflating folk exhumation ritual with medical observation, and Harwick's attorney sent a letter to the Burlington Diocese requesting Croke's reassignment. The journal survived only because Croke buried it inside a tin box wrapped in oilcloth beneath the vestry floor of St. Brendan's Mission Chapel in Linden, where it was uncovered during a building renovation in 1947 and delivered to the Vermont Historical Society, whose researchers would not understand what they held until a medical historian named Dr. Louise Martel examined the pressed watercress samples under a microscope in 1953 and confirmed what Croke had tried to tell anyone who would listen a century before. The 9th grave. The ground in Caledonia County does not give up its dead easily. The frost line in northern Vermont reaches 32 inches by January, and by early March of 1857, when Father Ambrose Croke arrived at the Connolly family plot on the far side of a stone-fenced pasture off the Linden Road, the soil above Nora Connolly's grave had only recently begun to soften, barely enough, he noted in his journal, to take the blade of a spade without the men having to beat the frozen crust loose first. It was the 9th grave he had attended in 4 years. He was 41 years old. He wore a black wool coat over his cassock, boots that had not been waterproof since 1854, and carried beneath his left arm a leather-bound journal he had purchased in Burlington in the autumn of 1853 for 35 cents at a stationer's shop on Church Street. The journal had 140 pages. By the morning of the Connolly exhumation, 97 of them were filled. He did not believe the body would be undead. He had not believed it at any of the previous 8. What he believed, as the Connolly brothers drove their spades into the softening earth and the cold March light came gray and flat across the pasture, was that he was about to see something that confirmed a pattern he had been tracking for 41 months. A pattern that, if he was reading it correctly, had nothing to do with the supernatural and everything to do with a half-mile stretch of cold water running through a farm 2 miles north of where he was standing. He opened the journal and began to write. Father Croke had arrived in Vermont in the autumn of 1848, one of several Irish-born priests dispatched by the Diocese of Burlington to serve the communities of Irish Catholic immigrants who had been arriving in Caledonia County since the middle 1840s, driven first by the Great Famine and then by the pull of the Northeastern Railroad construction boom, which had been consuming Irish labor at a rate of roughly 3,000 men per year across Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine since 1845. By 1850, Caledonia County had an Irish-born population of approximately 640 people, concentrated in the farming townships east of the Connecticut River watershed and in the smaller mill and rail towns along the Passumpsic River Valley. These were not wealthy communities. They were people who had survived one catastrophe and arrived in a new country still carrying its physical residue: the compromised lung tissue, the weakened immune systems, the accumulated bodily poverty of a population that had been chronically malnourished for the better part of a decade. Vermont in the 1850s was not a healthy place even for its established Yankee farming families. Tuberculosis, called consumption in the language of the era, was the leading cause of death in the United States throughout the first half of the 19th century, killing approximately 1 in 4 Americans who reached adulthood. In the urban tenements of Boston and New York, it moved through crowded rooms. In the rural townships of northern New England, it moved through families, one member coughing through the winter, a second weakening in the spring, a third dead before summer. Physicians in 1850 did not know what caused it. The prevailing theories divided roughly between those who believed it was constitutional, a hereditary weakness of tissue, and those who believed it was miasmatic, carried through bad air rising from swamps and low ground. Neither theory offered a useful path to prevention. Both theories left families experiencing it with no framework they could act on, which was, in part, why the other framework persisted. The New England exhumation tradition, misnamed in later scholarship as the New England Vampire Panic, had been documented in Vermont, Rhode Island, and Connecticut as far back as 1790. The practice was not rooted in European vampire mythology, despite the name later generations gave it. It was a local response to a local observation that when one family member died of consumption, others in the same household frequently sickened in sequence, as though the dead were drawing vitality from the living. The remedy, developed over decades of desperate folk practice, was to exhume the recently deceased and examine the condition of the body. If the body showed signs that struck the community as abnormal, if the organs appeared fresh, if there was liquid blood in the chest, if the face appeared flushed, it was understood to still be feeding, and the heart or lungs were removed and burned, sometimes mixed with broth, and given to the living sick as a curative. The practice was not celebrated by the communities that used it. It was endured. It was the last available option when medicine offered nothing, and faith alone seemed insufficient to stop a household from disappearing one cough at a time. Father Croke did not endorse it. He had made his position clear at St. Brendan's Mission Chapel in Linden within his first year of service. The Catholic Church did not sanction the mutilation of the baptized dead. The practice conflicted with the Church's teaching on resurrection, and any member of his congregation who participated in an exhumation without his presence and without the application of proper burial rites afterward, was placing their soul in a condition that he was not prepared to describe from the pulpit, but that would not be comfortable. What he would do, what he agreed to do, after several families came to him in genuine anguish, with no other priest for 40 miles, was attend, not to perform or sanction the exhumation itself, but to be present, to pray, to ensure the remains were treated with what dignity the circumstances permitted, and to observe. He brought the journal to the first exhumation in November 1853 because he was, at his core, a man who had been educated by Jesuits in Cork and who had absorbed permanently the Jesuit habit of writing down what he saw in the precise language of what he had actually seen, rather than the language of what he had expected or feared to see. The first entry read, Michael Feeney, age 34, died September of this year of consumption, interred 6 weeks. Soil, clay loam, poorly drained. Body, advanced decomposition, consistent with 6 weeks burial in conditions described. No anomaly observed. Family satisfied after prayer. God have mercy on them. 7 entries followed over the next 3 years. At each grave, Croke wrote what he saw. At 4 of the 8, the body showed the signs the family had feared. The apparent freshness, the reddish discoloration, the liquid pooling the community interpreted as blood. Croke described each precisely, and noted beside each description what he had also noted from his own reading. That putrefaction produces gases that can keep tissue pliant. That decomposition in cold, poorly drained soil proceeds more slowly than in warm conditions. That the reddish fluid families interpreted as blood was consistent with hemolysis, the breakdown of red blood cells releasing fluid, and not with the circulation of a living organism. He was not a physician. He had no medical training beyond what a 19th century Jesuit education included in natural philosophy. What he had was the habit of precise observation, and by the 3rd grave, something else. A creeping suspicion that had nothing to do with the condition of the bodies he was standing over. The Feeney farm drew water from Keene Brook. So did the Riordan farm, whose daughter Catherine had died in February 1854, whose exhumation was Croke's second. At the bottom of page 23 of his journal, after the Riordan entry, Croke wrote a single underlined question. Both families from the same watercourse. Is this noted elsewhere? By the 7th grave in the autumn of 1856, he had stopped asking it as a question. Keene Brook ran for approximately 3 miles through the northeastern corner of Caledonia County, before joining the Passumpsic River, 5 miles south of Lyndonville. Its upper reach, the 1.5 miles above the confluence, with a smaller unnamed tributary, passed through and alongside the property of Silas Harwick, who operated the largest dairy operation in Caledonia County, running 140 head of cattle across 320 acres of improved farmland and pasture on the brook's eastern bank. Harwick was 58 years old in 1856, a 3rd-generation Vermont farmer of English descent, a deacon in the Linden Congregational Church, and a selectman on the Caledonia County Board. He was, by every measure available to the communities around him, a man of substance and standing. His cattle were healthy. His fences were maintained. His barn was one of the largest private agricultural structures in the county. His cattle also produced waste. 140 head of dairy cattle produce approximately 63 pounds of manure per animal per day, roughly 8,800 pounds daily across the full herd, or approximately 1.6 million pounds annually. In 1856, there was no regulatory requirement governing the disposal of agricultural waste in Vermont. What went into the brook went into the brook. Croke was not a hydrologist. He did not know, in 1856, what a bacterium was. The word itself would not enter common scientific usage for another decade. But he had read, in a copy of the Lancet that arrived 6 months late at the Lyndonville General Store, and which he borrowed and read cover to cover in 2 evenings, a summary of John Snow's work during the 1854 Broad Street cholera outbreak in London, the study in which Snow had mapped cholera deaths against water pump locations in a Soho neighborhood and demonstrated, without microscope or germ theory, that a single contaminated water source was the origin point of an epidemic that had killed 616 people in 11 days. Snow had removed the pump handle. The outbreak had stopped. Croke read that article in late 1855. He sat with it for 3 weeks. Then he went back to the beginning of his journal and drew on the inside back cover a map. The map covered approximately 6 square miles of Caledonia County, centered on the Keene Brook watershed. He marked each of the 8 farms where he had conducted exhumations. He marked where each farm's drinking water was drawn. Brook access, or rain barrel. He marked the location of the Harwick dairy operation. He drew the course of the brook with a ruler borrowed from the Linden schoolhouse. He drew arrows indicating downstream direction. He sat and looked at what he had drawn for a long time. 7 of the 8 farms drew water directly from Keene Brook. The 8th drew from a well, but the well was located 20 feet from the brook's bank in soil conditions that Croke, standing at that graveside 18 months before, had described in his notes as poorly drained clay, likely in hydraulic connection with adjacent watercourse. Every household, every death, every sequence of consumption moving through a family, beginning with the person who drank most, working through the household in the order and degree that each member drank from the same source. He needed a sample. He needed something physical. In the first week of April 1856, he walked upstream to the point where the Harwick property began, a section of bank marked by a painted fence post, and waded into the shallows 8 inches deep and cold enough to make his feet ache through his boots. He pulled 3 stems of watercress growing in the downstream current below the fence line, where the water had spent approximately 800 feet traveling past the dairy operation's lower pasture. He pressed the stems flat between pages 89 and 90 of his journal, closed the cover firmly, and wrapped the whole thing in his coat for the walk back to the chapel. He collected a second sample in June, a third in August. Each was pressed and dated and placed in a specific location in the journal, with a written description of the collection point, the condition of the water, the color, the smell, low, persistent, agricultural, distinct from the clean running sections below the Pasumsic confluence, and the weather conditions at the time of collection. He had, by September 1856, a documented record spanning 36 months, 8 deaths, 8 family water sources, 1 upstream contamination point, and 3 physical specimens from the contaminated watercourse preserved between the pages of a bound journal. He was not a scientist. He was a country priest in worn-out boots who had attended 8 exhumations because his congregation had nowhere else to turn. But what he held in his hands was, in its essential structure, an epidemiological case. The same form of argument John Snow had made about Broad Street, built from observation and map-making rather than laboratory analysis, resting on a documented spatial relationship between a disease source and a disease cluster that could not be explained by heredity, by miasma, or by the restless dead. He wrote to the Vermont State Board of Health in Montpelier in October 1856. He described his findings in 3 pages of careful prose, enclosed a traced copy of his back cover map, and requested that a health inspector be sent to examine the Keene Brook watershed above the Harwick property line. The board replied in December. The reply was 1 paragraph. It thanked Father Croke for his communication and informed him that the board's current understanding of consumption held that the disease was constitutional in nature, that the Irish immigrant population of northern Vermont showed particular susceptibility consistent with heritable weakness, and that the contamination of surface water by agricultural operations, while a matter of ongoing public health interest, had not been demonstrated to have any connection to pulmonary consumption. It added in a final sentence that Croke underlined 3 times before closing the letter. The board further notes that records of exhumation practices among certain immigrant communities in Caledonia County have been reviewed and found to be inconsistent with Vermont statute concerning the treatment of human remains, and encourages the relevant clergy to discourage such practices among their congregants. First wall, built in Montpelier, signed by a board that had not examined a single page of his journal. He came to the 9th grave in March 1857 because Nora Connolly had been the 4th member of her household to die of consumption in 22 months, and because her brother Sion, standing at the grave's edge with a spade, his breath fogging in the morning cold, had told Croke the previous Sunday that if this one showed what the others had shown, he was going to dig up every Connolly who had died since 1851 and burn the whole field, because he was not going to watch his remaining children follow their mother into the ground on the same timeline as every other family between Linden and East Burke. Croke understood. He had no authority to stop it. He had the journal, and he had 3 watercress specimens, and he had a letter from Montpelier telling him his evidence was the product of a superstitious community practicing illegal exhumation. He came to the 9th grave because Sion Connolly needed him there, and because the 9th was the 9th, and he had been counting since the 1st, and the pattern he was counting toward did not become less true because a board in Montpelier had declined to read its documentation. They opened the ground at 10:15 in the morning. Nora Connolly had been buried for 8 weeks. The soil above her was clay loam, poorly drained, as it was at every grave in this watershed, as he had noted since the first entry on page 1. And the cold had slowed decomposition to a degree that produced, when the coffin lid came up, exactly what the Connolly brothers had expected and feared: a face that appeared flushed, tissue that hadn't collapsed entirely, a discoloration that, in the gray March light, looked like color in a face that should have had none. Croke knelt at the graveside and wrote for 6 minutes before he said anything. He described what he saw in the language of what he saw: decomposition stage, soil conditions, temperature estimate, the precise character of the discoloration as it appeared in the available light. He described the smell, He noted the drainage condition of the surrounding soil and the proximity of this farm's well to the bank of Keene Brook, 15 feet eastern side, downstream of the Harwick fence line by approximately 1 mile and 40 yards. He noted Nora Connolly's age, 31 years, and the names and ages of the 4 other household members who had died before her in sequence, the oldest at 62 and the youngest at 7. Then he stood and read the prayers for the dead in Latin while the Connolly brothers replaced the coffin lid and the grave began to fill. He did not go home afterward. He went to the chapel at St. Brendan's, unlocked the vestry, and sat at the small writing table where he prepared his Sunday sermons. He opened the journal to a fresh page, page 98, and wrote at the top, March 7th, 1857, the 9th, and below that, 2 lines that would not be read by anyone capable of fully understanding them until 1953. 9 families, 9 water sources, 1 brook, 1 operation upstream. The dead are not feeding on the living. Something in the water is feeding on all of them alike, and the name of the man who owns the water is Silas Harwick. He wrapped the journal in oilcloth. He placed it inside the tin box where he kept the chapel's small reserve of communion wine money. He placed the tin box beneath the vestry floor in a cavity between the foundation stones that he had noticed on his first winter in the chapel and had never used for anything, because he had never needed to hide anything before. He locked the vestry. He walked to the post office in Lyndonville and wrote a second letter. Not to Montpelier this time, not to any authority that had already told him what his evidence was worth. He addressed it to the editor of the Burlington Free Press. He wrote 4 pages. He described 9 exhumations, 9 water sources, 1 brook, 1 dairy operation, and 32 months of recorded observations. He included a second traced copy of his back cover map. He posted the letter that afternoon. He walked back to the chapel as the light was failing. The vestry door was standing open. He had locked it 3 hours before. Inside, the writing table had been moved. The small chest where he kept the communion vessels was open. The floorboard above the cavity between the foundation stones had been lifted and replaced, recently enough that the dust seal around its edge was broken. He knelt and lifted the board. The tin box was still there. He opened it. The journal was still inside. He sat back on his heels in the vestry of a mission chapel in Linden, Vermont, in March 1857, and understood, with the cold certainty of a man who had been counting things carefully for 3 years, that someone had already read the letter before it reached Burlington. The question was how. The vestry door had been opened with a key. That was the first thing Croke established, because establishing it mattered. A broken lock could be reported to the county constable as ordinary trespass without explaining what had been searched for, while a key implied something more deliberate than a thief looking for communion silver. He examined the lock on the morning of March 8th, with a candle held close to the mechanism. No scratches on the plate, no damage to the bolt. The wood of the frame was unmarked. Someone had opened it the way a person opens a door when they have the means to do so without forcing anything, quietly, purposefully, and with enough confidence in their standing to leave without covering their tracks. 3 people held keys to St. Brendan's vestry: Father Croke himself, the deacon of the chapel's lay committee, a farmer named Patrick Quinn, who lived 4 miles north on the Burke Road, and the woman who cleaned the chapel on Saturdays, a widow named Bridget Hannigan, who had worked this arrangement since 1851 and who had never in 6 years given Croke any reason to think her discretion was anything less than complete. He did not suspect either of them. A key could be pressed into wax and a copy cut at any locksmith in Lyndonville in under an hour. Anyone who had held a key to St. Brendan's at any point in the previous 6 years, a prior lay committee member, a previous cleaner, the carpenter who had replaced the vestry window in 1854, could have retained the impression. What mattered was not who had the key. What mattered was why they had used it on the day after he posted a letter to Burlington describing 9 deaths and the name of one man he held responsible for them. He went to the Lyndonville post office on the morning of March 9th. The postmistress, Margaret Fisk, was 53 years old, a deacon's widow who had managed the Lyndonville postal operation since her husband's death in 1848, and who ran it with the particular combination of efficiency and embedded knowledge that comes from being the single transit point for every written communication entering or leaving a town of 1,400 people for 9 years. She knew who received newspapers from which cities. She knew who wrote to whom in what frequency and could, from the weight and handwriting of an envelope alone, estimate its contents to a reasonable degree of accuracy. She was not a gossip. She was a careful woman, and she was visibly uncomfortable when Croke placed his hands on the counter and asked her, as gently as he could manage, whether anyone had inquired about a letter posted the previous day addressed to the Burlington Free Press. She took a long time arranging a stack of mail slips before she answered. "A man came in yesterday afternoon," she said, "after 4 o'clock. I don't know his name. He was not from Lyndonville. I know every face in this town, and he was not one of them. He asked whether any letters had been posted that day destined for Burlington, and he showed me a dollar bill and set it on the counter and did not say what it was for." She paused. "I told him I couldn't discuss the post." She smoothed the mail slips again. He took the dollar back and left. But Father, he did not seem surprised that I said no. He seemed like a man who'd already gotten what he came for from somewhere else. Croke thanked her and walked back to the chapel. The letter had been posted at 2:30 in the afternoon. The man had arrived at the post office after 4. 1 hour and 30 minutes. Long enough, if the chain moved quickly, for a message to travel from someone who had seen Croke at the post office window to someone with instructions about what to do if a letter went out to Burlington. The vestry break-in hadn't been a search for the journal. The vestry had been searched after the letter was posted, which meant whoever entered did not know exactly what Croke had sent to Burlington and wanted to know whether there was physical documentation that might accompany or follow it. They had not found the journal because the tin box was below the floorboard, and the floorboard had been replaced with sufficient care that a person searching in limited light would not have noticed the disturbed dust seal unless they were looking for it specifically. They had not been looking for it specifically. They had been looking for papers, letters, copies, written materials on a desk or in a chest. This told Croke something useful. They were aware of his findings, but not of the journal's existence, which meant his best protection was ensuring things stayed that way. He had not sought out Dr. Elias Weld. The introduction came through Sion Connolly, who had gone to Weld in late March 1857 because his youngest surviving child, a boy of 9 named Thomas, had begun coughing in the persistent, tightening way that Sion had watched take his wife and 3 other children, and who arrived at Weld's surgery in East Burke, willing to ride 14 miles in mud season rather than watch the pattern repeat itself one more time. Weld had examined Thomas and asked Seon, as part of his standard intake, where the family drew its water. Seon had told him. Weld had gone quiet in a way that Seon recognized, because he had seen that same controlled silence on Father Croke's face at the edge of 7 different graves. Weld sent a message to Croke at the chapel on April 2nd. A single line, written on his prescription paper. I believe you may be working on the same problem I have been working on for 3 years. If you are willing to compare notes, I will come to Linden on Thursday. He was 56 years old, a graduate of the Vermont Medical College in Woodstock, class of 1824, who had practiced in Caledonia County for 29 years. His manner was the particular bluntness of a rural physician who had delivered too many bad diagnoses to soften the language around them. He was a Congregationalist, and he had, Croke knew secondhand, been heard in the past to describe the Irish exhumation tradition as a medical menace dressed in folk superstition. He arrived on Thursday, April 5th, carrying a satchel and setting it on Croke's vestry table with the directness of a man who has decided to trust someone he is not sure he entirely likes. He opened the satchel. He produced a journal of his own, not leather-bound, a working physician's account book, brown covers, dates running from January 1854 to the present. He opened it to a page marked with a strip of cotton bandaging and turned it so Croke could read. The page listed 14 deaths, all consumption, all in households. Weld had attended in the Keene Brook watershed. Dates, names, ages, duration of illness from first presentation to death. Beside each name, in a column, Weld had added in a second ink, bluer, more recent, a notation. Well or brook or unknown. 11 of the 14 showed brook. 2 showed well, proximate to brook. 1 showed unknown. 14 deaths in 3 years. Against Croke's 9 in 4 years. 23 documented deaths in total. All in the same watershed. All downstream of the same 320 acres of improved dairy farmland on Keene Brook's eastern bank. I presented this to the State Health Board in 1854, Weld said, before Croke could speak. I received a letter explaining that consumption deaths among the Irish immigrant population of northern Vermont reflected constitutionally determined susceptibility, and that no environmental intervention was indicated. I was told that the exhumation practices in the affected communities were likely contributing to familial spread of the illness through exposure of living persons to decomposing tissue. He paused. In other words, they told me the priest was making it worse. Croke looked at the list of 14 names. He looked at his own journal. He said quietly, "Between the 2 of us, we have 23 deaths, 22 water sources, 1 brook, 1 farm." "Yes," Weld said, "and I have something else." He reached into the satchel a second time and produced a letter. It was folded twice, the paper slightly yellowed, the address on the outside reading Silas Harwick, Esquire, Caledonia County, Vermont, in an official hand. The date was September 14th, 1852. The letterhead was that of the Vermont Board of Agriculture's Northern District Inspection Office. Weld had obtained it through a clerical contact in Montpelier, a man who had processed the original filing and retained a copy in a personal folder before the originals were archived, then quietly lost. in a building reorganization in 1855. The letter informed Harwick that an agricultural inspection of his Keene Brook operations, conducted on September 2, 1852, had identified evidence of significant animal waste discharge into the Keene Brook watercourse at multiple points along the eastern pasture boundary, that this discharge posed a potential hazard to downstream water users, and that Harwick was required under Vermont agricultural statute to implement a remediation plan within 90 days or face a formal board citation. The letter was signed by the district inspector. Beneath the signature, in a different hand, a penciled notation: Selectman H. Spoke with Inspector October 4th. Matter tabled pending further review. Selectman H. Silas Harwick, Caledonia County Selectman, who had spoken with the inspector who had written the warning letter, and the matter had been tabled, not resolved, not cited, tabled. 5 years before the morning Croke and Weld sat in a vestry reading the letter together, Harwick had known that his operation was contaminating the brook. He had spoken to the right person, and the warning had been filed, and then, in a building reorganization that arrived with convenient timing, lost. 23 people had died downstream of a farm whose owner had known since 1852 that his water was dangerous. Croke sat for a long time without speaking. Outside the vestry window, the April mud had begun to firm at the edges of the chapel road. The month was turning. In the fields above the brook, Harwick's 140 cattle were moving out to spring pasture. The brook was running fast with snowmelt. Somewhere downstream, in 11 farmhouses on both sides of the Keene Brook Valley, families were drawing water from the same source they had always drawn from, not knowing what Croke and Weld now knew with complete documentary certainty. "We need to go to the county court," Croke said. Weld looked at him with the expression of a man who has already tried the door. "Selectmen's board that recommends appointments to the county court," he said. "Harwick is on the he has been for 11 years. There was a silence. "Then we go higher," Croke said. They went to the county court on April 14th because going higher requires somewhere to stand first. They presented together, Weld with his physician's account book and the 1852 agriculture inspection letter, Croke with a written summary of his 9 documented cases and the back cover map from his journal, copied onto a fresh sheet to avoid revealing the journal's existence or location. The county judge was a man named Augustus Pell, 61 years old, who had served on the Caledonia County bench since 1841. He listened for 22 minutes. He examined the 1852 inspection letter carefully, or appeared to examine it, holding it at the angle of a man performing the gesture of reading rather than reading. He set it down. He said that the letter described an agricultural condition, not a legal one, and that the connection between water quality and pulmonary illness remained a matter of ongoing medical dispute that the county court was not positioned to adjudicate. He said that the 9 exhumation cases documented by Father Croke raised separate concerns of their own relating to Vermont statute on the treatment of interred remains. He said he would take the matter under advisement. He did not take it under advisement. Weld learned, through the same clerical contact in Montpelier, that Pell had sent a message to Harwick's attorney within 48 hours of the April 14th hearing. The message's contents were not recorded. Its existence was First failure. They wrote jointly to the Vermont State Legislature on April 28th. A formal petition, 7 pages, signed by both a licensed physician and a credentialed clergyman, requesting an independent investigation of water quality conditions in the Keene Brook watershed and a review of the 1852 agricultural inspection findings. They sent it to 3 members of the legislature's Public Health Committee. 2 did not reply. The third sent a polite 2-paragraph acknowledgement stating that the petition had been received and would be considered during the committee's autumn session, which convened in October. It was late April. October was 6 months away. In 6 months, at the mortality rate the Keene Brook watershed had demonstrated since 1852, between 4 and 7 additional people would die. Second failure. Croke had been watching the Harwick farm hands since February, not with any formal plan, but with the attentiveness of a man who has learned to notice peripheral details because central facts have been repeatedly refused. The Harwick operation employed between 12 and 18 seasonal workers, depending on the time of year, most of them transient. Men who arrived in spring for planting and pasture work, stayed through dairy season, and moved on before the first hard frost. They were not Irish. They were a mixture of French-Canadian border crossers, displaced New Hampshire farm laborers, and a small number of men who appeared, from their speech patterns, to have come from further east, Maine, possibly maritime Canada. They lived in a long bunkhouse on the western side of the Harwick property, close to the brook, and they drew their water from a pump sunk directly into the brook bed. They were, in other words, drinking from the most contaminated section of the watercourse. Croke had not been able to track their deaths because transient workers did not have communities to report them. They did not have family in the county. They did not have farmers' wives who came to the priest. When a seasonal laborer died of consumption on a Vermont farm, he was buried quietly on the property or in the nearest paupers section of the county cemetery, and his name went into no record that a priest or a physician would likely encounter. He began visiting the Lyndonville County Cemetery in early April, walking the pauper section row by row. In 8 weeks, he found 6 markers, wooden stakes, no carving, only penciled notes in weatherproof ink that the cemetery keeper updated each year, for men described as farm laborer, unknown origin, dating from 1853 to 1856. He could not prove they were Harwick farm hands. He could not prove they had died of consumption rather than accident or some other cause. He had no physician's records for them because no physician had attended them. But he knew they were drinking from the pump at the brook's edge, and he knew the pump was 12 feet from the lower pasture drain. He wrote this in the journal on May 3rd under the heading, Additional Cases, Unconfirmed. He pressed a 4th watercress specimen between pages 103 and 104, collected from directly below the pump location, the water green-tinged at the bank edge, and carrying a smell he now recognized as clearly as he recognized a voice. He was building something that no authority he had yet approached had been willing to look at straight. He did not stop building it because the alternative was to stop, and stopping meant waiting for the 10th family. The man appeared at the chapel door on the evening of May 19th. He knocked 3 times, the way someone knocks when they are not sure they have the right to knock at all. He was approximately 40 years old, weathered the way outdoor farm labor requires, thin, with the particular look of a man making a decision he has gone back and forth on for weeks. He said his name was Orrin Tutt. He said he was Silas Harwick's farm manager. He said he had been Harwick's farm manager for 11 years. He said he did not want to come in. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and spoke in a low voice, looking occasionally back toward the chapel road. He said that in March 1857, the week after Croke had posted his letter to Burlington, Harwick had gathered his senior staff and told them that a Catholic priest in Linden had been spreading dangerous misinformation about the property and about the quality of the brook, and that any worker who spoke to Croke or to the physician in East Burke would be dismissed without wages owed, and would find no reference from the Harwick operation available to them anywhere in the county. He said that Harwick had also, in that same meeting, made a change to the farm operation Söderstjärd, the lower pasture drain, which had previously emptied through a clay pipe directly into the brook at a point 12 feet from the drinking pump, had been rerouted at the end of March 1857. The rerouting had taken 3 workers 4 days and had moved the drain outlet 40 yards downstream and 2 feet deeper into the bank, so that it discharged below the water line rather than on the surface. Not eliminated, rerouted, hidden. Croke asked Tutt why he was telling him this. Tutt looked at his hat for a moment. "My wife's sister," he said, "lives on the Danforth farm 1/2 mile below the rerouted outlet. She has 2 children. She has been drawing water from the same point in the brook since 1849. He looked up. She started coughing in January. He said he had something else. He said there were records maintained in Harwick's own farm office in a locked cabinet behind the desk that documented the original drain construction in 1849 and a complaint by a neighboring farmer in 1851 about water quality, together with a private note from Harwick instructing the farm manager at that time to decline to acknowledge any connection between our drainage and downslope conditions. He said he could obtain access to that cabinet. He said he needed 3 days to do it safely. "Come back on Thursday," Croke said. Tutt put his hat on. He stepped back into the dark of the chapel road. "I'll be here," he said. He was not there on Thursday. On the morning of Thursday, May 22nd, 1857, a farmer driving the road between Harwick's upper gate and the Lindenville Village Center found a man lying in the ditch on the western verge of the road, approximately a 1/4 mile below the Harwick property line. The man was conscious but unable to stand. His right arm was broken in 2 places. He had a head wound that the farmer, arriving at the county surgeon's office with Tutt in the back of his wagon, described as consistent with having been struck from behind by something heavy and flat. A plank, possibly, or a fence rail. Tutt was taken to the county surgeon. He remained there for 9 days. When he was released, he did not come back to the chapel. He did not send a message. He left Caledonia County on the Passumpsic Railroad's southbound coach on June 2nd, and no record of him exists in Vermont after that date. The cabinet in Harwick's farm office remained locked. Croke stood in the vestry on the evening of May 22nd and opened his journal to a fresh page, page 108, and wrote the date, and below it, Orrin Tutt, farm manager, knows what is in the cabinet, found on the road this morning with a broken arm and a blow to the back of the head. He wrote it in the flat, precise language he had used since November 1853. because the language of what he had actually seen was the only language that had ever held any of this together. He pressed the journal closed. He thought about the tin box under the vestry floor. Then he thought about Tut's sister-in-law on the Danforth farm, half a mile below the rerouted drain outlet, drawing water from a brook that now hid what it had previously only disclosed. And he thought about the fact that the drain had been rerouted in late March 1857, 3 weeks after he had posted his letter to Burlington, which meant Harwick had not rerouted the drain because a physician and a priest were building a case against him. He had rerouted it because he already knew the case could be built. He had known since September 1852, when the agricultural inspector's letter arrived, and a conversation with one county selectman made it go away. He had made one calculation then, and had now made a second. The first calculation had bought him 5 years. He was betting the second would buy him enough time for whatever he had in motion to complete itself. Croke did not know what was in motion. He knew only that his evidence was buried under a vestry floor, that the one man willing to walk inside Harwick's operation had been put in a county surgeon's bed and had then left the state, and that somewhere in a locked cabinet on a working dairy farm in Caledonia County, there were documents that would convert everything he had built from a priest's observation into something that no board, no judge, and no Montpelier committee could file under advisement and forget. The question was how to reach a locked cabinet on a property whose owner had already demonstrated with considerable clarity how he dealt with people who came too close to what was inside it. He was still considering that question at midnight when he heard, from somewhere beyond the chapel road, the sound he had not expected and could not immediately explain. A woman's voice, speaking quickly in Irish, saying something he had to ask her to repeat, because he had not heard that dialect in 9 years, and his ear needed a moment to find it. When she said it again, he understood. She said, "The drain is not the only thing he moved." Her name was Maeve Kehoe. She was 29 years old, born in County Clare, arrived in Vermont in 1849, on a timber boat that docked in Burlington and discharged its human cargo onto a wharf with no processing office and no receiving agent, simply the cold air off Lake Champlain, and a printed notice on a post directing Irish arrivals to the labor agency on Pearl Street. She had worked as a domestic on the Harwick farm since 1851, cooking and laundering for the seasonal workers in the long bunkhouse by the brook, and she had watched from a distance of 6 years and 40 feet what the brook did to the men who drank from it. She had buried 2 of them herself, not in the county cemetery, not in any pauper section with a wooden stake and a penciled name, but in the back field behind the northernmost pasture fence, in ground Harwick had designated for the purpose with the same practical absence of ceremony that he applied to the disposal of cattle that didn't survive the winter. She told Croke this standing in the chapel doorway, speaking quickly in the Connaught Irish she hadn't used regularly since 1849, and which came back to her in the urgency of the moment with the particular clarity of a language learned in childhood. She told him that the 2 men, both French-Canadian seasonal workers, names she knew as Louis and Marcel, surnames she had never been told, had died in the bunkhouse in the autumn of 1855 and the spring of 1856, respectively, and had been buried in the back field by Harwick's farm manager at the time, before Orrin Tutt had taken over the position. and she told him that 3 weeks ago, the same week Orrin Tutt had been found on the road with a broken arm, the graves in the back field had been opened and the bodies moved. Moved where? Croke asked. The county poor farm burial ground, she said. I saw the wagon go out at night. I recognized the shovels in the back. She had come to the chapel because Tutt had told her, before he was injured, that he intended to speak to the priest. She had come because her sister-in-law on the Danforth farm was coughing. She had come because she had watched 6 men die by a brook on a farm whose owner had told every one of his workers, with the flat authority of a man who has never needed to raise his voice, that the water was clean and the consumption was a weakness that certain kinds of people carried in their blood. She did not wait for Croke to ask her anything else. She handed him a folded piece of paper, a work roster page, torn from the bunkhouse record book, with Louis and Marcel's names written in a foreman's hand beside the dates of their last worked days. Evidence that they had existed on that property. Evidence that they had been breathing and laboring and recorded in a ledger on specific dates in 1855 and 1856. She had been carrying it inside her boot for 11 days. She left before Croke could ask her name a second time. He learned it later from Sion Connolly, who knew her from the Slovak Chapel Social, where the Irish and the French Canadian and the Carpatho-Rusin communities of Caledonia County occasionally overlapped. He pressed the roster page flat and placed it inside the journal between pages 110 and 111. Then he sat for a long time looking at the vestry floor and thinking about what Harwick had just done. The bodies had been moved for one reason and one reason only: to eliminate the evidence of deaths that had never been officially recorded. If Louis and Marcel rested in unmarked ground on Harwick's backfield, a sufficiently motivated investigator could, in theory, exhume them, examine them, and establish that they had died of consumption, establishing 2 more deaths in the most contaminated section of the watershed, and raising the obvious question of why they had been buried privately rather than reported to the county authorities. Moved to the poor farm burial ground under false registry entries, they became 2 more anonymous paupers in a section of ground that no one would connect to a dairy operation on Keene Brook. It was careful. It was the action of a man who had been managing this situation for 5 years, and who had learned, through practice, exactly how many moves ahead he needed to think. Croke needed to move faster than Harwick expected. He sent a message to Dr. Weld that same night. Come Thursday. Bring your account book. We are going to Burlington. They took the street. Johnsbury and Lake Champlain Railroad coach on Thursday, May 28th, departing Lyndonville at 6:40 in the morning and arriving in Burlington at 11:15 after a journey of 4 hours and 35 minutes through the Connecticut River watershed and across the spine of the Green Mountains. The Burlington Free Press offices were on a street 2 blocks from the waterfront. The editor was a man named Charles Aldrich, 52 years old, who had run the paper since 1847 and who had in that time published investigations into the Burlington coal yard price-fixing arrangement of 1851, the Chittenden County road contract frauds of 1853, and the conditions in the Burlington Women's Prison that had resulted in a legislative reform committee in 1856. He was not a man who was easily impressed by documentation, because documentation arrived at his desk regularly from people who wanted things printed and who did not always understand the difference between a complaint and a provable case. He was, however, visibly different from Harold Wick in Ashtabula, who had handled Croke's evidence the way a man handles an object he has already decided not to keep. Aldrich read Weld's account book for 20 minutes. He examined the 1852 agricultural inspection letter. He looked at Croke's back cover map, the copy, not the original, and traced the arrows downstream with one finger. He looked at the work roster page with Louis and Marcel's names. He set it down and looked at both of them across the desk and said, "Why hasn't this gone to the legislature?" Weld said, "We petitioned in April. We were told it would be reviewed at the autumn session. In the meantime, the man whose farm is contaminating the water source is a county selectman with a relationship to the county bench judge, and with, apparently, sufficient reach to intercept a letter posted from Lyndonville to this office on March 7th. Aldrich looked up sharply at the last part of that sentence. A letter to this office? Croke told him about the March 7th posting and the man at the Lyndonville post office window after 4. Aldrich said nothing for a moment. Then he picked up the work roster page again. "How did you come by this?" Croke told him about Maeve Kehoe, without using her name. Aldrich set the page down. "I need 3 days to verify the 1852 inspection letter against the Agriculture Board's filing records in Montpelier," he said. "If the original exists and matches this copy, I will run the story in the Friday edition." He ran it in the Friday edition of June 5th, 1857. The headline read, "Consumption Deaths in Caledonia County. Medical Evidence Points to Brook Contamination near Harwick Farm." The story covered 32 column inches across 2 pages, cited Dr. Weld by name and Father Croke by title, included the Vermont Agriculture Board's 1852 inspection findings, and named Silas Harwick as the owner of the upstream dairy operation. It did not accuse Harwick of deliberate poisoning. It described a documented pattern, a documented warning, a documented failure of the warning to produce any remediation, and 23 documented deaths in a watershed downstream of a contamination source the state government had identified 5 years earlier and then allowed to remain. On Friday evening, Harwick's attorney delivered a letter to the Free Press offices charging defamation and demanding retraction. The Friday edition was already distributed. Aldrich's response to the attorney was 2 sentences, delivered verbally through his clerk. "We stand by our documentation. If Mr. Harwick wishes to file, he is welcome to do so, and we would welcome the discovery process that would follow." The defamation suit was never filed. The Vermont legislature convened a special investigative committee on the Keene Brook water quality matter in October 1857, not in the autumn session's ordinary course, but as a specific response to the Free Press coverage, which had been reprinted in summary by 4 other New England papers by mid-June, and which had generated by September letters to the legislature from 17 Caledonia County families describing their own consumption losses. The committee was chaired by a representative from Windsor County, who had no professional or financial connection to Harwick or to any Caledonia County interest. This was, Weld told Croke, the first piece of genuine good luck their evidence had encountered in 4 years. The committee's investigation ran from October 1857 through February 1858. It examined the Agriculture Board's original 1852 inspection files. The originals were located, misfiled rather than destroyed, in a basement cabinet in the Montpelier Agriculture Office, and confirmed that Harwick's farm had been formally warned of brook contamination and had used political influence to table the required remediation. It interviewed Dr. Weld over 2 days in November. It reviewed the death records for all Caledonia County consumption fatalities between 1851 and 1857 in the Keene Brook watershed. It interviewed 8 surviving family members. It took records from the county poor farm burial ground and confirmed the registration of 2 male paupers in 1857 whose entry dates corresponded to the night Maeve Kehoe had seen the wagon leave the Harwick farm. It did not subpoena Father Croke's journal. Croke offered it voluntarily, carrying it to Montpelier in January 1858 in the same oilcloth-wrapped tin box, presenting it to the committee's secretary with a written inventory of its contents on a separate page. The secretary logged it as Exhibit 14. Clergyman's personal observational record, 9 exhumation accounts, 4 watercourse specimens, 107 pages of annotation. The committee read it. The chairman wrote in his personal diary that evening, a diary that the Vermont Historical Society acquired in 1931. The priest's journal is the most methodical document of its kind I have ever examined. If it had been produced by a Yale-trained physician instead of a Catholic clergyman in a mission chapel, this investigation would have begun in 1854. The committee's final report was published in March 1858. It ran to 44 pages. It found that the Harwick dairy operation had contaminated Keene Brook over a period of at least 6 years, and likely longer. That this contamination had been identified by state agricultural inspectors in 1852 and suppressed through the actions of a county selectman, and that the resulting deaths, which the committee placed conservatively at 23 but acknowledged could be higher, represented a preventable public health failure of the first order. It recommended that the legislature establish mandatory water quality inspection protocols for agricultural operations adjacent to shared watercourses, that the Agriculture Board's inspection records be reorganized to prevent future misfiling, and that the contamination source be remediated immediately. It did not recommend criminal prosecution. The report's language on this point was careful in the way that legislative language is careful when the word criminal would require a level of intent that the existing legal framework made difficult to establish, and that the committee's membership did not have the appetite to pursue against a man of Harwick's standing. He had known. The 1852 letter proved he had known. But proving that knowing constituted criminal negligence rather than civil liability under Vermont law as it existed in 1858 was a question the committee declined to answer. Silas Harwick sold the Keene Brook dairy operation in September 1858. The sale price was $8,400, considerably below market value, Weld noted in his account book, for 320 acres of improved agricultural land with a functioning dairy and a railroad spur connection. He retained his selectman's position until 1861. He lived until 1879. He is buried in the Linden Congregational Church Cemetery, where his stone reads, Farmer, Deacon, Beloved, no other inscription. The brook ran clean by 1860. No consumption death was recorded in a Keene Brook watershed household in Caledonia County after 1861. Father Ambrose Croke was reassigned to a mission chapel in Sherbrooke, Quebec, in April 1858, 6 weeks after the committee report was published. The Diocese of Burlington issued no formal explanation. The Burlington Diocese's bishop had received in January 1858 a letter from a Caledonia County landowner, not Harwick, but an associate of Harwick's whose name appears in no published account of the investigation, suggesting that a Catholic priest's involvement in a public health controversy was creating a sectarian dimension to the story that was not serving the interests of Catholic parishioners in Vermont's predominantly Protestant North. The bishop had replied in February that the matter would be addressed through normal pastoral rotation. The rotation arrived in April. Croke went to Sherbrooke. Before he went, he returned to St. Brendan's vestry and lifted the floorboard above the cavity between the foundation stones. The committee had returned Exhibit 14, his journal, in March, after the report was finalized. He wrapped it again in the oilcloth. He placed it in the tin box. He placed the tin box in the cavity. He replaced the floorboard, pressing the dust seal closed with his thumb. He sent a letter to no one explaining what was beneath the floor. He had watched over 4 years what letters did when they traveled through this county. He trusted the floor. He lived in Sherbrooke until 1871, when he was transferred to a parish in Montreal. He died in Montreal in 1889 at the age of 73 of a pulmonary illness that the Montreal parish records describe in their death register as consumption. He is buried in a Catholic cemetery in the Notre-Dame-des-Neiges section of Mount Royal, in a plot marked with a stone that gives his name, his birth year, and his years of service. No mention of Caledonia County. No mention of 9 exhumations. No mention of a brook or a tin box, or 4 pressed watercress specimens between the pages of a journal that nobody read in full until 69 years after he laid it beneath a vestry floor. The renovation crew found the tin box on September 14th, 1947. St. Brendan's Mission Chapel had been closed since 1931, its congregation absorbed into a larger parish in Lyndonville, and the building had stood unused for 16 years, its roof sagging at the northeast corner, and its vestry floor separating from the foundation sill along the eastern wall. The crew, hired to stabilize the structure before a sale, were pulling up the damaged floorboards when the crowbar caught on something solid between 2 foundation stones at a depth of 8 inches. The crew chief, a man named Raymond Pelkey, 44 years old, pried the tin free and opened it at the workbench in his truck. He found the oilcloth. He found the journal inside the oilcloth. He closed the tin, placed it in the cab of the truck, and drove it that afternoon to the Vermont Historical Society offices in Montpelier, because his wife's sister worked there, and because he understood, from the dates on the cover page and the care of the oilcloth wrapping, that whatever this was, it had been put where it was found by someone who intended it to be found eventually. The Historical Society cataloged the Croke Journal as Accession, 1947 to 88. It was examined by a staff archivist, noted as a significant primary source on 19th century Catholic mission practice and on Vermont's New England exhumation tradition, and placed in the manuscript collection. The 4 pressed botanical specimens between pages 89, 91, 93, and 103 were cataloged as organic inclusions, condition good, species unidentified. No one examined them under magnification. No one connected them to the 1858 Legislative Committee report, which was itself in the Historical Society's collection in a folder 12 yards away. It was a medical historian named Dr. Louise Martel, 38 years old, a researcher at the University of Vermont's Department of Public Health History, who made the connection in 1953. She had been working through the 1858 committee report as a secondary source for a chapter on 19th century Vermont public health policy, and had noted in a footnote the reference to Exhibit 14, Clergyman's Personal Observational Record, 4 watercourse specimens. She had requested accession 1947 to 88 from the manuscript collection. She had read the full journal in 2 days, and then she had taken the 4 pressed watercress specimens to the university's biology department and asked a colleague named Dr. Francis Tarrant to examine them under a compound microscope. Tarrant called her back on a Thursday afternoon in November 1953. He said the specimens were in remarkable condition given their age, pressed flat and dried, held between smooth pages in a consistently cool, dark environment for approximately 97 years. He said that the plant material itself was clearly watercress, consistent with aquatic growth in a cold northern stream. He said that the surface of the plant material, visible under magnification at 400 times, showed something he had not expected. Colonies of rod-shaped bacteria adhered to the stem tissue, preserved in the desiccated state of the specimens. He said that their morphology was consistent, he chose his words carefully, with Mycobacterium bovis, bovine tuberculosis bacillus, not human tuberculosis, bovine tuberculosis, the form of the disease carried by cattle and transmitted to humans through contaminated water and unpasteurized milk, identified as a distinct species by Robert Koch in 1882, and recognized as a major source of human tuberculosis mortality throughout the 19th century. A species whose presence in surface water downstream of a large dairy operation in northern Vermont in the 1850s would be consistent with, and in fact would require, the kind of contamination that a 1852 agricultural inspection had described as significant animal waste discharge into the Keene Brook watercourse. Father Ambrose Croke had pressed those specimens into his journal in 1856 and 1857 with no knowledge of germ theory, no microscope, no laboratory, and no scientific framework for what he was collecting, beyond the observation that the water smelled wrong and that the families who drank it were dying. He had described the smell in 4 separate journal entries: low, persistent, agricultural, distinct from the clean running sections below the Pasumsik confluence, with the precision of a man trained to report what he saw rather than what he expected. He'd been right. He'd been right about the source, right about the mechanism, right about the contamination, and right that the death pattern he was tracing was not hereditary, not miasmatic, and not supernatural. He had been right 30 years before Koch identified the bacillus, 27 years before Vermont passed its first milk quality inspection ordinance in 1884, and 96 years before a medical historian in Burlington read his journal and drove across Montpellier on a November afternoon to ask a biology professor to look at 4 pieces of dried watercress under a microscope. Dr. Martel published her findings in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1955 in a paper titled 19th Century Water Contamination and Bovine Tuberculosis Transmission, a retrospective case study from Caledonia County, Vermont. The paper cited Croke's journal as the primary source, reproduced his back cover map, and included a photographic reproduction of the microscopy results from the pressed specimens. It described his methodology, the cross-referencing of water sources across 9 household deaths, the collection of physically located specimens, the spatial mapping of deaths against a single upstream contamination point, as consistent with the epidemiological methods pioneered by John Snow in London in 1854, arrived at independently and simultaneously by a Catholic mission priest with a 35-cent journal and no formal scientific training. The paper noted that Croke had attempted to present his findings to the Vermont State Health Board, the Caledonia County Court, and the state legislature across a period of 18 months, and had been dismissed by each on jurisdictional, political, or sectarian grounds. It noted that he had been reassigned out of the region 6 weeks after the committee report that largely vindicated his findings. It noted that his journal had spent 90 years under a vestry floor. It asked in its final paragraph a question it did not attempt to answer. How many of the 23 documented deaths in the Keene Brook watershed between 1851 and 1861, and how many of the additional suspected deaths among transient farm laborers whose names do not appear in any county record might have been prevented had the evidence gathered by Father Croke between 1853 and 1857 been reviewed on its merits, rather than on the basis of its author's nationality, religion, and professional standing. The paper was reprinted in the Vermont Historical Quarterly in 1956. It was cited in a chapter of a 1961 textbook on the history of American epidemiology, in which Croke's journal was described as a foundational document in the pre-bacteriological observation of waterborne infectious disease. His name appeared in the index between John Snow and Ignaz Semmelweis, the Hungarian physician who had identified hand hygiene as a factor in childbed fever in 1847 and had been dismissed by the Viennese medical establishment until 18 years after his death. Both men had been right. Both men had been ignored. Both men had kept their records with the patient, unglamorous persistence of people who understood that the record itself is the argument, that evidence does not expire, that a fact documented in 1856 is still a fact in 1953, and that the silence of an institution is not the same thing as the non-existence of what the institution chose not to hear. The 23 families of the Keene Brook watershed dead were named for the first time in a single publication in 1973, a Vermont Historical Society monograph that compiled Croke's journal entries, Weld's account book, the 1858 committee report, and Martel's 1955 paper into a single documented record. The monograph listed each name, each age, each date of death, each farm, each water source. It listed Louis and Marcel, the 2 French-Canadian workers moved to the poor farm burial ground, identified finally through the work roster entry that Maeve Kehoe had carried in her boot. It listed the 6 pauper markers Croke had found in the Lindenville Cemetery section. It listed Thomas Connolly, Sean's youngest, who had survived, who had been 9 years old when Croke attended his sister's grave, and who was, in 1973, 75 years old and living in Barre, Vermont, and who told the Historical Society researcher, who found him simply, "The priest said the water was wrong. My father changed the well. I'm still here." Yet, the monograph included as its final page a photographic reproduction of page 3 of Father Croke's journal. The first page, dated November 1853, the Feeney exhumation. 6 lines of careful handwriting, precisely formed, ending with the sentence Croke had written while kneeling at the edge of a grave in frozen Caledonia County clay on a November morning when he was 37 years old and had not yet understood what he was about to spend 4 years recording. The sentence read, "God have mercy on them." He had not been able to save them. He had been a country priest with a 35-cent journal and no allies except a country physician with a brown account book and a postmistress who had kept her nerve when a stranger set $1 on her counter. He had been dismissed by a health board, a county judge, a legislature, and a bishop. He had watched the one man willing to testify from inside the operation get carried off the road on a spring morning with a broken arm. He had buried his evidence under a floor and walked to Quebec carrying nothing but the language of what he had seen. But the watercress was still in the journal, and the journal was still in the tin, and the tin was still under the floor, and the floor held. That is what the bodies that wouldn't decay were telling the families who stood over them in the cold Caledonia County clay for 9 consecutive winters. Not that the dead were restless, not that the soul persisted in malevolent communion with the living, but that something in the water was wrong, that the earth was holding on to these people in a way that the earth should not have been holding on to them, that the farm upstream had put something into the brook, that had put something into the bodies that could not be washed out or prayed out or burned out, only found and named and traced back to its source. They could not name it in 1853. The word for it would not exist in common usage for another 30 years. But the shape of the truth was always there. 9 graves in frozen ground. 1 priest with a journal. The bodies that wouldn't decay, pointing downstream, pointing to the farm, pointing to the man who had known since 1852 and had let them drink. 47 carbon stubs in a tobacco tin. 4 watercress stems pressed between 2 pages. The record survives. It always survives. Not because the powerful allow it, because the ordinary people who keep it understand, in some part of themselves, that institutional pressure cannot reach, that a number is not just a number, and a body is not just a body, and a brook is not just a brook, and what cannot be named in the moment it happens can always, given enough time, enough tin boxes, enough vestry floors, be named later.